My son didn't show up at my wife's funeral. Hours later, he posted photos drinking on a Caribbean island with my daughter-in-law, enjoying life while we can. That's when I received a message from my wife. "Love, come to our house now." I immediately panicked because I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My son didn't show up to my wife's funeral. Hours later, he posted photos drinking on a Caribbean island with my daughter-in-law, living life while we can. And that's when I received a message from my wife. "Honey, come to our house now." I immediately panicked because Margaret had been dead for 3 days. I'm Robert, and I've been married to Margaret for 42 years. She passed away after a long battle with cancer, and today should have been about honoring her memory, saying goodbye, and finding some peace in the midst of this overwhelming grief. Instead, I found myself staring at my phone in the funeral home parking lot, my hands shaking as I read a text message that couldn't possibly exist. The funeral had been a disaster from the moment it started. I kept looking toward the back of the chapel, expecting to see David walk through those doors. My only son, 35 years old, who hadn't visited his dying mother once in her final month. His wife Jessica had made excuses every time I called. "David's swamped with work," she'd say, or "We're dealing with our own family crisis right now." But Margaret kept asking for him. Even in her final days, when the morphine made everything fuzzy, she'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "Is David coming today?" He never came. At the service, Margaret's sister Helen sat beside me, dabbing her eyes with tissues. Our neighbors filled the pews behind us. Margaret's co-workers from the library, where she'd worked for 20 years, came to pay their respects. Even Mrs. Patterson from down the street, who could barely walk with her arthritis, made the effort to be there. But David's seat remained empty. I kept checking my phone throughout the service, hoping for a call, a text, anything that would explain his absence. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe his flight was delayed. I made excuses in my head because the alternative was too painful to accept. After the burial, as people offered their condolences and shared memories of Margaret, I finally received a notification on my phone. But it wasn't from David. It was from Instagram, showing me that my son had posted a new photo. My fingers trembled as I opened the app. There he was, bronzed and grinning, holding a fruity cocktail with a little umbrella. Jessica was beside him in a bright yellow bikini, her arms spread wide against a backdrop of crystal-clear blue water and white sand. The caption read, "Living life while we can. Sometimes you just need to escape and remember what happiness feels like." The timestamp showed it was posted just 20 minutes ago. While I was standing beside his mother's grave, listening to the pastor say final prayers, David was posting vacation photos. I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart, that had been cracking slowly for months as I watched Margaret fade away. This was something deeper, something that connected me to the son I thought I knew. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd helped with college applications, the young man who'd called me every Sunday for years. That connection snapped like a dried twig. Helen noticed me staring at my phone. "Robert, are you all right?" I couldn't speak. I just handed her the phone and watched her face change from concern to disgust. "That selfish little..." She caught herself, glanced around at the other mourners, and lowered her voice. How could he do this? Today of all days? I took the phone back and scrolled through the comments under his post. Friends congratulating them on their much-needed getaway. Hearts and fire emojis. People telling them they deserved this and to enjoy every moment. Not one person seemed to know that David's mother had just been buried. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message. The sender showed up as Margaret, and my heart stopped. "Honey, come to our house now." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. Margaret's contact information was still in my phone, but this had to be some kind of sick joke. Maybe David had somehow gotten access to her phone. Maybe it was a delayed message that had been stuck in some server somewhere. But the timestamp showed it had just been sent. Helen saw my face go white. "Robert, what is it?" I showed her the message. She looked at it for a long moment, then at me. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I know it's impossible," I said, my voice barely audible. But there it is. The rational part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Phone glitches, delayed delivery, someone playing a cruel prank. But another part of me, the part that had loved Margaret for over 4 decades, the part that knew her better than anyone else in the world, was telling me something different. Margaret had always been methodical, always one step ahead. When she was diagnosed with cancer, she'd immediately started organizing everything. She'd updated her will, arranged for the flowers at her own funeral, even picked out the dress she wanted to be buried in. "I need to make sure you'll be okay," she told me. "I need to tie up all the loose ends." What if this wasn't a loose end? What if this was intentional? I looked around the cemetery one more time. Most of the mourners had left, heading back to their cars or to the reception at the church. I pulled Helen aside. "I need to go home," I said. "Of course you do. You're exhausted. This has been an impossible day." "No, you don't understand. I need to go home now, alone." She studied my face, seeing something there that made her nod slowly. "Do you want me to come with you?" I shook my head. Whatever was waiting for me at home, whatever Margaret had planned, I had the feeling I needed to face it myself. The drive home felt like it took forever, even though it was only 15 minutes. Our house looked exactly the same as it had this morning when I'd left for the funeral, but somehow it felt different, empty in a way that went beyond Margaret's absence. I sat in the driveway for a moment, looking at the windows, half expecting to see Margaret's silhouette moving inside, but the house was dark and still. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the front door. I stepped into our house and immediately I knew something was different. Not just the absence of Margaret's presence, but something else. Something had been moved. On our kitchen table, where this morning there had been nothing but the morning newspaper I hadn't had time to read, there was now a manila envelope with my name written on it in Margaret's careful handwriting. My heart pounded as I approached it, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silent house. Inside the envelope were several items. A key I didn't recognize, a handwritten letter from Margaret, and a small piece of paper with an address I'd never seen before. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Robert," it began, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears about David have been confirmed. I pray I'm wrong, but if he didn't come to my funeral, if he chose to be somewhere else during your time of grief, then you need to know the truth about our son." I had to stop reading and sit down. Margaret had anticipated this. Somehow she'd known that David wouldn't show up today. The letter continued. 3 months ago, when I was getting my treatments and you were at work, I noticed some irregularities in our bank statements. Small amounts missing here and there. Nothing that would immediately catch your attention because you trusted David with helping us manage things when I got too sick to handle the paperwork myself. I remembered those days. Margaret had always been the one to handle our finances, but as the chemotherapy made her weaker, she'd asked David to help with paying bills and organizing paperwork. He'd seemed so eager to help, so concerned about making sure we didn't have to worry about mundane things while dealing with her illness. "I started keeping track," the letter went on. "And Robert, over the past 2 years, David has stolen nearly $47,000 from our accounts. He's been using our credit cards for expensive dinners, luxury hotels, and shopping sprees. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box number 212. Inside, you'll find copies of everything, all the evidence I've been gathering." My chest felt tight. I could barely breathe. $47,000. That was money we'd saved for retirement, money we'd planned to use for Margaret's medical expenses that insurance didn't cover, money that could have paid for better treatments, private nurses, anything that might have made her final months more comfortable. "The address is for a private investigator named Sarah Chen. I hired her 6 weeks ago when I realized the scope of what David was doing. She's been documenting everything. David doesn't just have a spending problem, Robert. He's been lying to us about his job, his income, everything. He was fired from his position at the marketing firm 8 months ago but never told us. He's been using our money to maintain the illusion that he and Jessica are successful." I set the letter down and stared at the wall where Margaret and I had hung family photos over the years. Pictures of David as a baby, his first steps, his graduation from college. In every photo, he was smiling, looking like the perfect son. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind? But even as I asked myself these questions, I realized I hadn't been completely blind. There had been signs. The expensive clothes David wore when he visited, even though he claimed to be struggling financially. The way he always seemed to have money for elaborate gifts for Jessica, but never contributed to his mother's medical expenses. The evasive answers when I asked about his work. I picked up the letter again, my hand steadier now, but my heart racing. I wanted to confront him, But then I realized something that broke my heart even more than the theft. I overheard a phone conversation he had with Jessica 3 weeks ago. He was standing in our backyard thinking I was asleep upstairs. He said, and I'll never forget these words, "It won't be much longer now. Mom's getting worse every day. Once she's gone, we'll inherit everything and we can finally live the life we deserve." The words hit me like a physical blow. I doubled over, actually gasping for air. David had been waiting for his mother to die, counting on it, planning for it. "Robert, I need you to know that I never told you about any of this because I didn't want your last months with me to be filled with anger and heartbreak over David. I wanted us to have peace, but I also couldn't let him get away with this. I've changed our will. I've moved our money. I've protected what we built together, and I've left instructions for how to handle this situation." The letter went on to explain that Margaret had quietly moved the majority of their savings into accounts that David didn't know about. She'd consulted with a lawyer and restructured their estate in ways that would prevent David from inheriting anything substantial. But more than that, she'd created a plan to expose his behavior and make him face consequences for what he'd done. "I know this is a lot to process on the day of my funeral, my love. But David's absence today tells me everything I need to know about who he really is. The son we raised, the boy we loved, he's gone. This person who stole from his dying mother, who celebrated while his father grieved alone, this isn't our David anymore. Maybe he never was." I found myself crying then, not just from grief over losing Margaret, but from the devastating realization that I'd lost my son long before today. Maybe I'd never really known him at all. The final part of the letter contained specific instructions. I was to visit the safety deposit box tomorrow, review all the evidence Margaret had compiled, and then meet with Sarah Chen to discuss the next steps. There was also a smaller envelope marked, "Open only if David comes home demanding his inheritance." I looked at that envelope for a long time, knowing that its contents would likely destroy whatever relationship David and I had left. But after seeing those vacation photos, after reading about the phone conversation Margaret had overheard, I wasn't sure there was a relationship left to destroy. My phone buzzed with another notification, another Instagram post from David. This time it was a video of him and Jessica at what looked like an expensive restaurant, toasting with champagne. The caption read, "Celebrating new beginnings. Life is too short to waste on negativity. Here's to living authentically and surrounding ourselves with people who truly matter." I stared at that last line. People who truly matter. Apparently his dying mother and grieving father didn't make that list. I walked to Margaret's side of our bed and sat down, holding her pillow against my chest. It still smelled like her perfume. For 42 years she'd been my partner, my best friend, my anchor. Even in death, she was still protecting me, still thinking ahead, still trying to shield me from pain while ensuring that justice was served. Tomorrow I would go to the bank. I would meet with the private investigator. I would learn the full extent of my son's betrayal and decide how to respond. But tonight, I just wanted to sit in the house Margaret and I had shared and try to process the fact that in the span of one day, I'd buried my wife and discovered that my son was a stranger. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with Margaret's key clutched in my sweaty palm. The safety deposit box revealed everything she'd promised and more. Bank statements showing systematic withdrawals, credit card bills for luxury purchases I'd never authorized, receipts for expensive dinners while Margaret was in the hospital receiving chemotherapy. Photos the private investigator had taken of David and Jessica at high-end stores, shopping with what I now knew was stolen money. But the most damaging evidence was a folder labeled phone records. Sarah Chen had somehow obtained recordings of David's conversations with Jessica. I listened to them in my car in the bank parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. "She's getting weaker every day," David's voice came through the small recording device. "The doctor thinks maybe another month or two at most." "Thank God," Jessica's voice responded. "I can't keep pretending to care much longer. Did you see that pathetic card she sent for my birthday? Like I want some cheap drugstore sentiment from a dying woman. Once she's gone, we'll have access to everything. Dad's too emotional to think straight about finances. He'll probably just hand everything over to me to manage. And then we can finally get out of this boring town and move somewhere with actual culture. Maybe California. I've always wanted a house near the beach." I had to turn off the recording. I sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Just breathing, trying to process the casual cruelty in their voices. They weren't just stealing money. They were counting down the days until Margaret died. 3 days later, David finally came home. I was sitting in Margaret's garden when I heard his car pull into the driveway. She'd spent hours out here, especially during her treatments when the fresh air helped with her nausea. I'd been coming out here every evening since the funeral, just sitting among her roses and feeling close to her. David walked around to the backyard like he owned the place, Jessica trailing behind him. They were both still tan from their Caribbean vacation, and Jessica was carrying shopping bags from expensive stores. They looked relaxed, refreshed, like people returning from a well-deserved break, rather than like people who'd missed a mother's funeral. "Hey, Dad," David said casually, as if his absence needed no explanation. "Sorry, we couldn't make it back in time. Flight delays, you know how it is." I looked at him for a long moment. This was my son, the baby I'd held in my arms 35 years ago, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball and drive a car, but the person standing in front of me was a stranger wearing my son's face. "You missed your mother's funeral," I said quietly. David shrugged. "I know, and I feel terrible about it. But Mom would have wanted us to be happy, right? She wouldn't have wanted us to cancel our trip and lose all that money." Jessica stepped forward, her voice sickeningly sweet. "We were devastated that we couldn't be here, Robert, but we knew you had everything under control. You're so strong." I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from Margaret's garden off my hands. "Come inside. We need to talk." In the living room, David immediately started looking around with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property. He picked up one of Margaret's antique vases, examining it like he was estimating its value. "So," he said, setting the vase down, "I guess we need to start talking about practical things. The house, Mom's life insurance, the business assets. I know it's hard to think about right now, but the sooner we get everything organized, the better." "You're right," I said. "We do need to talk about practical things." I walked to the desk where Margaret used to pay bills and pulled out the smaller envelope she'd left for me, the one marked, "Open only if David comes home demanding his inheritance." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of dates, amounts, and account numbers. "What's that?" David asked, trying to sound casual, but I could hear tension creeping into his voice. "Your mother kept very detailed records," I said, not looking up from the paper. "She was always good with numbers." Jessica and David exchanged a quick glance. She moved closer to him, her hand touching his arm in what looked like a supportive gesture, but felt more like a warning. "Records of what?" David asked. I looked up at him then, really looked at him. "Of the $47,000 you've stolen from us over the past 2 years. The silence in the room was deafening. David's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, fear, and then something harder. Something calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally. I read from the paper. "March 15th of last year, $800 withdrawn from our savings account. Same day you and Jessica had dinner at Le Bernardin in the city. Receipt shows a bill for $750. David's jaw tightened. "You're confused, Dad. You're grieving, and you're not thinking clearly." April 22nd, $1,500 charged to our credit card at Nordstrom. Jessica's Instagram post from that day shows her with shopping bags from Nordstrom, talking about her shopping therapy day. Jessica's face had gone pale, but David stepped forward aggressively. "This is insane. Mom was sick. She was on medication. She was probably confused about the finances." June 3rd, I continued, my voice getting stronger. $2,000 transferred to your personal account. Same day you posted about your surprise weekend getaway to Martha's Vineyard. "Stop it," David said, his voice rising. "Just stop it. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that drove Mom crazy when she was sick." That was when something inside me snapped. "Don't you dare talk about your mother that way. She died asking for you. Every single day she asked when you were coming to visit." "And I was dealing with my own problems," David shouted back. "You think it was easy for me watching her waste away? You think I enjoyed seeing her like that? So you decided to steal from her instead?" David's mask finally slipped completely. The concerned son, the grieving family member, all of it fell away, and I saw who he really was. "We didn't steal anything," he said coldly. "We took what we needed to survive. You and Mom never understood what it was like trying to build a life in this economy. We have expenses. We have image to maintain with our money. With money that was going to be ours anyway." Jessica suddenly burst out, then immediately looked like she regretted speaking. David shot her a sharp look, but it was too late. The truth was out. "There it is," I said quietly. "You were waiting for her to die." "That's not what she meant." David said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. I walked to the desk and pulled out the recording device Sarah Chen had given me. Would you like to hear the conversation you had with Jessica 3 weeks ago? The one where you discussed how much longer your mother had to live? David went completely still. Jessica's face crumpled and she started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic, of someone who'd been caught. You recorded us? David's voice was barely a whisper. Your mother recorded you. She hired a private investigator when she realized what you were doing. She documented everything. David sank into a chair, his face in his hands. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the son I'd raised, someone who might be capable of shame or regret. But when he looked up, his eyes were cold and calculating. Fine, he said. You caught us, so what do you want? You want us to pay it back? We can work out a payment plan. I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, caught in his lies, he was trying to negotiate. What I want, I said slowly, is for you to leave. Both of you. Get out of my house and don't come back. This is my childhood home, David protested. You can't just kick me out. It's my house. My name is on the deed. And you're not welcome here anymore. Jessica had stopped crying and was now looking at David with something like desperation. Tell him about the debts, she hissed. Tell him we need the inheritance money. David glared at her, but I could see the panic in his eyes now. We have some financial obligations, he said carefully. We were counting on. We made some investments based on future assets. You spent money you didn't have because you assumed your mother would die and leave you everything. It's not that simple, David said, but his voice was weak. I walked to the front door and opened it. Yes, it is that simple. Get out. David stood up slowly, his face a mixture of anger and fear. You're going to regret this, Dad. We're your family. When you're old and sick and alone, don't come crying to us. I'm already alone, I said. My wife is dead and my son died long before she did. They left without another word, Jessica sobbing dramatically as they walked to their car. I watched from the window as David sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, probably trying to figure out his next move. Finally, they drove away. Only then did I allow myself to sink into Margaret's favorite chair and finally grieve for everything I'd lost. I didn't hear from David for 2 weeks after I threw him out. I spent those days following Margaret's detailed instructions, meeting with lawyers and financial advisors, learning the full scope of what she'd put in motion before her death. My wife had been planning for this confrontation for months, and her preparation was thorough and devastating. The private investigator, Sarah Chen, met me at a coffee shop downtown to go over the final details. She was a small, serious woman with sharp eyes who spoke in precise, measured sentences. Your wife was very specific about her wishes, Sarah told me, spreading documents across the table between us. She wanted to make sure David would face real consequences, not just emotional ones. She showed me bank statements proving that Margaret had quietly moved $83,000, nearly all of our savings, into a new account that only I had access to. She'd also changed the beneficiaries on all our insurance policies and retirement accounts. But that's not the most significant part, Sarah continued. She also documented David's theft and filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. It's been sitting there waiting for your approval to proceed. I looked at the criminal complaint, seeing David's name listed as the defendant. Margaret had signed it 3 weeks before she died. If you decide to move forward with this, Sarah explained, David would be facing felony charges. Grand theft. Given the amount and the fact that the victims were elderly and one was terminally ill, he could be looking at serious jail time. I set the papers down with shaking hands. Margaret had given me the power to destroy our son's life completely, but she'd also given me the choice. There's more, Sarah said gently. We traced where the stolen money went. David and Jessica are in significant debt. Credit cards, personal loans, a lease on a luxury apartment they can't afford. They've been living entirely beyond their means, counting on your inheritance to cover everything. She handed me another file. They owe approximately $62,000 in various debts. Without the inheritance they were expecting, they're facing bankruptcy within the next few months. I drove home that day with Margaret's final plan weighing on my mind. She'd positioned everything perfectly. David had stolen from us, lived off our money, and waited for her to die so he could inherit what was left. Now he would get exactly what he deserved, nothing. That evening, I called my lawyer, Margaret's longtime friend Patricia Williams, and told her to proceed with changing the will exactly as Margaret had specified. Instead of leaving everything to David, Our entire estate would go to the Margaret Holloway Foundation for Cancer Research, a charity Margaret had established in her final weeks. 3 days later, David called me. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice sounded strained, desperate. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I want to make things right." "It's too late for that, David." "No, it's not. Look, I know we made mistakes, but we're family. We can work through this." I could hear Jessica in the background, whispering urgently. They were clearly in crisis. "Actually," I said, "I think it's time we met again. Come by the house tomorrow at 2 o'clock. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you. We'll be there." The next afternoon, David and Jessica arrived looking haggard. Jessica's designer clothes couldn't hide the stress lines around her eyes, and David had lost weight. They sat on the edge of the couch like people who weren't sure they were welcome. "Dad," David began, "I want to apologize. Really apologize. We were wrong to take that money without asking. We were wrong to miss Mom's funeral. We've been thinking about it, and we want to pay everything back." Jessica nodded eagerly. "We've already talked to a financial advisor about setting up a payment plan. We can have the money back to you within 5 years. I looked at them both for a long moment. 5 years, maybe less, David said quickly. We're both getting new jobs, better paying positions. We can make this right. I stood up and walked to the desk where I'd left the documents Patricia had prepared. That's very generous of you, but unnecessary. What do you mean? Jessica asked. I handed David a copy of the new will. Your mother changed her will before she died. You're not inheriting anything. David's face went white as he read. This says everything goes to a foundation. The Margaret Holloway Foundation for Cancer Research. Your mother established it a month before she passed away. You can't do this, Jessica said, her voice rising. We need that money. We have obligations. What kind of obligations? I asked. David and Jessica exchanged desperate looks. Finally, David spoke. We borrowed money, significant amounts. We were supposed to pay it back after your mother died and you inherited her estate. It's not like that. David protested weakly. It's exactly like that. You took out loans counting on your inheritance to pay them back. Just like you stole from us counting on the fact that we'd never prosecute our own son. Jessica started crying. Robert, please, you don't understand. These aren't just credit card debts. We borrowed from some very serious people, if we can't pay them back. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. They'd gotten involved with loan sharks or worse. How much do you owe? I asked. $62,000, David admitted. But if we can just get part of the inheritance, even half, we can negotiate with them. I walked back to the desk and pulled out another document. I have a proposition for you. David leaned forward eagerly. Anything, Dad. What do you need? I want you to sign this confession detailing everything you stole from us over the past 2 years. Every amount, every date, every lie you told us. Why? Jessica asked suspiciously. Because if you sign this, I'll give you $50,000 to pay off your debts and disappear from my life forever. The room went silent. David read through the confession, his face getting paler with each page. This admits to felony theft, he said finally. Yes, it does. And if you sign it, I'll have legal proof of your crimes. But I'll also give you enough money to start over somewhere else. And if we don't sign it? Jessica asked. I pulled out the criminal complaint Margaret had filed. Then I file this with the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. Sarah Chen has already documented everything. You'll be arrested within the week. David stared at the papers in his hands. You're blackmailing us. I'm offering you a choice. The same choice your mother wanted you to have. Take responsibility for what you've done and accept the consequences, or face much worse consequences in court. Jessica grabbed David's arm. We have to sign it. We don't have a choice. There's one more condition, I said. You both signed statements agreeing to never contact me again. No phone calls, no letters, no showing up at my house. You take the money and you disappear. David looked around the living room, at the photos of him as a child, at the life he was giving up. For a moment, I thought I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. When it started, I just needed a little help. I thought I'd pay it back before you noticed. But you didn't pay it back. You took more, and you celebrated when your mother died. David flinched. I didn't celebrate. You posted vacation photos during her funeral. He had no answer for that. He looked at Jessica, who was crying again, then back at the confession. If I sign this, will you promise not to file criminal charges? As long as you honor the agreement and stay out of my life permanently. David picked up the pen with a shaking hand. $50,000? $50,000 and you never see me again. He signed the confession. Jessica signed her statement. I wrote them a check from the account Margaret had set up. Money that had once been theirs by right but was now a payment for their exile. They left that afternoon with a cashier's check and suitcases full of their belongings. David paused at the door, looking back at me with something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it. I didn't respond. Sorry wasn't enough anymore. After they drove away, I sat in Margaret's garden and called Patricia Williams. It's done, I told her. The confession is signed. They're gone. Good, she said. Margaret would be proud. You gave them more mercy than they deserved. That night I opened a bottle of wine Margaret and I had been saving for our 45th wedding anniversary and toasted her memory. She had protected me even in death, and she had given our son one last chance to show who he really was. He had failed that test, but I was finally free. For 3 months after David and Jessica left town with their $50,000, I heard nothing from them. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, they had actually learned something from the consequences of their actions. Maybe they had used the money to start fresh somewhere else, found legitimate work, and begun building an honest life. I should have known better. The first sign that things were falling apart came through Helen, Margaret's sister. She called me on a Tuesday evening while I was reading in Margaret's favorite chair. "Robert," she said, her voice tight with concern, "I just got off the phone with my friend Linda in Phoenix. She says she saw David and Jessica at a casino there last weekend." My stomach dropped. A casino? Not just visiting, Robert. Linda works in the hospitality industry there. She said they were staying in the high-roller suites, throwing money around like they were millionaires. David was playing poker at $1,000 minimum tables. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar weight settle in my chest. Of course they were gambling. The $50,000 I'd given them to pay off their debts and start over had become gambling money instead. "There's more," Helen continued reluctantly. "Linda said Jessica was drunk, bragging to other guests about how they'd played the old man perfectly and gotten exactly what they wanted. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Even after everything, some small part of me had hoped that David might use this opportunity to change, to become the man Margaret and I had tried to raise. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Sarah Chen, the private investigator Margaret had hired. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I thought you should know that David and Jessica are back in town, but they're not staying anywhere nice." She met me at the same coffee shop where we'd discussed Margaret's final plans. This time, the news she brought was devastating in a different way. "They burned through the $50,000 in 6 weeks, she reported, sliding a folder across the table. "Most of it went to gambling losses in Phoenix and Las Vegas. The rest went to luxury hotels and expensive dinners. They never paid off a single debt." I opened the folder to find photographs of David and Jessica looking haggard and desperate. They were clearly broke again, but this time they looked scared. "The people they owe money to aren't being patient anymore," Sarah continued. "According to my sources, David and Jessica are facing some very serious pressure to pay up. They've been staying in cheap motels, moving every few days. And now they're back here. They're back because they're desperate. Jessica's family won't help them anymore, and they've burned bridges with friends. You're their last hope." Sarah showed me more photos taken over the past week. David trying to get work at various businesses around town, being turned away from each one. Jessica crying outside a bank after presumably being denied for loans. Both of them looking thin and defeated. "There's something else," Sarah said carefully. "Yesterday, David went to the newspaper office. He spent 2 hours talking to a reporter." My blood went cold. "About what?" "I don't know for certain, but given their situation, I suspect he's trying to create public pressure. Make you look like the cruel father who abandoned his son in his time of need." That evening, David proved my suspicions correct. He called me for the first time since leaving town. "Dad." His voice was hoarse, desperate. "We need to talk. I thought our agreement was that you'd never contact me again." "The agreement is void," he said quickly. "We never got a chance to establish ourselves properly. The money wasn't enough. The money was supposed to pay your debts and give you a fresh start. It's complicated, Dad. There were unexpected expenses, setbacks. Look, can we just meet? Please? I'm your son. We can work this out." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a diner outside of town. I arrived to find David alone, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 months. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. "Where's Jessica?" I asked as I sat down across from him. "She left me," he said flatly. 2 weeks ago. Said she couldn't handle the stress anymore. Found some guy with money and took off to Florida. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but I pushed it down. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you? Because you're the reason she left. If you hadn't cut me off, if you just helped us like family is supposed to help family, none of this would have happened." "David, you stole from your dying mother." "I borrowed money from my family when I was in trouble. There's a difference. You never intended to pay it back. You don't know what I intended." His voice was getting louder, attracting stares from other diners. "You just decided I was guilty and threw me away like garbage." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the man I'd raised, any hint of accountability or genuine remorse. I saw only anger and entitlement. "What do you want, David?" "I want you to do the right thing. I want you to help your son when he's down. I want you to remember that family means something. How much money do you want?" His eyes lit up with desperate hope. 30,000 would get me back on my feet. I have a job opportunity in California, but I need money to get there and get established. "No, 20,000 then, just to pay off the most urgent debts." "No, 10,000, Dad. Just 10,000 to keep me alive." I looked at him sitting across from me, this stranger wearing my son's face, and I felt something I'd never expected to feel toward my own child. Complete emotional detachment. "You had $50,000 3 months ago," I said calmly. "You gambled it away instead of paying your debts or building a life. Why would giving you more money change anything?" "Because I've learned my lesson. Because I'll do better this time." "You haven't learned anything, David. You're still blaming everyone else for your problems. You're still looking for someone else to bail you out of the consequences of your choices." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. The false humility disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been talking to some people around town, telling them about how you abandoned your own son after his mother died. How you're sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars while your only child is homeless and desperate. Are you threatening me? I'm telling you that people are starting to ask questions about what kind of man lets his son suffer like this, about what really happened to Mom's money, about whether you're the grieving widower you pretend to be." I felt a chill run down my spine. David was threatening to destroy my reputation the same way he'd destroyed everything else in his life. "People around here have known me for 40 years, I said. "They knew your mother. They knew what kind of person she was. Do you really think they'll believe I suddenly became someone different?" "They'll believe what they see," David said. "A rich old man who won't help his desperate son. And when the newspaper runs the story about how you kicked me out right after Mom's funeral, how you refused to give me any inheritance, people will start to wonder." I stood up slowly, looking down at this person who shared my DNA but had become someone completely alien to me. "Do whatever you think you need to do, David, but our relationship is over." I left him sitting in that diner, and as I drove home, I realized that Margaret had been right about everything. She'd known this day would come. She'd known that David would burn through whatever money we gave him and come back for more. She'd known that eventually he would try to destroy us rather than face the truth about himself. 3 days later, the newspaper story ran. The headline read, "Local son claims elderly father abandoned him after mother's death." David had painted himself as the victim of a cruel and greedy father who had cut him off without cause. But Sarah Chen had been right about something else too. People in our town had known Margaret and me for decades. They knew what kind of people we were, and more importantly, they'd been watching David for years too. The story backfired spectacularly. Instead of gaining sympathy, David found himself facing a community that had watched him grow up, watched him disappoint his parents repeatedly, and watched him miss his own mother's funeral for a vacation. The newspaper received dozens of letters supporting me and condemning David's behavior. People who had known Margaret shared stories about how worried she'd been about David's irresponsibility. Former employers came forward to talk about David's work history and character. Within a week, David had made himself a pariah in the only community that might have helped him. But he still wasn't done fighting. The final confrontation came on a cold November morning, exactly 8 months after Margaret's funeral. I was in her garden preparing the roses for winter when I heard footsteps on the path behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Hello, David." He looked terrible, thin, unshaven, wearing clothes that hadn't been washed in days. The desperate anger that had sustained him through months of failed schemes had been replaced by something worse. The hollow-eyed look of someone who had finally run out of options. "I have nowhere else to go," he said simply. I continued working with the roses, cutting back the dead growth, protecting what could survive the winter. "That's not my problem anymore. I'm your son." "No," I said, finally turning to face him. "My son died a long time ago. Maybe he never existed at all." David's composure cracked. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your blood. You can't just erase that. Watch me." He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, and I realized he was probably drunk or worse. The people he owed money to had clearly found him. There was a fresh bruise on his face, and his left hand was wrapped in a dirty bandage. "They're going to kill me," he said quietly. "The people I owe money to. They're not playing games anymore." I felt nothing. No surge of paternal protection. No urge to rescue him one more time. Margaret's careful documentation of his cruelty, his callous disregard for her suffering, had burned away any lingering attachment I might have felt. "You should have thought about that before you gambled away the money I gave you." I was desperate. Jessica left me, I had nothing. I thought if I could just win enough to pay everyone back. "You thought you could solve your gambling problem by gambling more. How did that work out for you?" David's face contorted with rage. "You heartless bastard. No wonder Mom was so miserable at the end, living with someone who could just turn off their feelings like a switch." That was when I snapped, not into anger but into perfect crystalline clarity. "Your mother wasn't miserable because of me," I said calmly. "She was heartbroken because of you, because her son cared more about her death than her life. Because you stole from her while she was dying and counted the days until you could inherit what was left." "That's not true." I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings Sarah Chen had made. David's voice filled the garden, casual and cruel. "She's getting weaker every day. The doctor thinks maybe another month or two at most." David went white as he heard his own words played back to him. "Your mother heard that conversation," I continued. "She heard you celebrating the fact that she was dying. She spent her last weeks knowing that her only child was waiting for her funeral like it was Christmas morning. I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did. And now you want me to save you from the consequences of your choices because we share DNA. But DNA doesn't make family, David. Love makes family. Loyalty makes family. Respect makes family. You never showed your mother any of those things." David sank down onto the garden bench where Margaret used to sit when she was too weak to stand for long. "What am I supposed to do? I don't care what you do. That's not my responsibility anymore." He looked up at me with something like desperation. "I'll change. I'll get help. I'll go to therapy, to gambling addiction meetings, whatever you want. You had that chance 8 months ago when I gave you $50,000. You had that chance 3 months ago when I warned you about the path you were on. You've had that chance every day of your adult life, and you've chosen to waste it. So that's it. You're just going to let me die?" I looked at him sitting on Margaret's bench, in Margaret's garden, demanding that I save him from problems he'd created by betraying everything she'd stood for. "You're already dead to me," I said. "The David I loved, the son Margaret and I raised, he's been gone for years. I don't know who you are anymore, but you're not my family." David stood up unsteadily. "Fine, if that's how you want it, but don't think this is over. I still have options." "No, you don't. I have the signed confession documenting your theft. I have recordings of your conversations with Jessica. I have evidence of everything you've done. If you ever try to contact me again, if you ever set foot on my property again, I'll have you arrested." Something in my voice must have convinced him that I meant it, because he backed away slowly. "You'll regret this," he said. But there was no conviction in his voice anymore. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is not protecting your mother from you sooner." David left that day, and I never saw him again. I heard through Helen that he'd been arrested 2 weeks later for trying to break into a house across town. He was sentenced to 18 months in county jail. When he got out, he left town for good. 6 months later, I received divorce papers in the mail. Jessica was divorcing David from Florida, citing abandonment and mental cruelty. She was also suing him for the money she'd lost in their failed schemes. David's life had completely unraveled, just as Margaret had predicted it would. But my life was just beginning. The Margaret Holloway Foundation for Cancer Research became my purpose. I threw myself into fundraising, organizing events, working with researchers. Margaret's final gift to me wasn't just protection from David's greed, it was a way to honor her memory while helping other families facing the same battle we'd fought. Within 2 years, the foundation had raised over $300,000. We funded a research fellowship at the University Medical Center where Margaret had received treatment. We provided support for families who couldn't afford the hidden costs of cancer care, the things insurance doesn't cover. I met other people who had lost spouses, other parents who had been disappointed by their children, other families who had been torn apart by illness and greed. I found a community of people who understood that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Helen became one of my closest friends, helping with the foundation and sharing memories of Margaret that kept her alive in my heart. Patricia Williams, our lawyer, became a trusted advisor and companion. Sarah Chen stayed in touch, updating me occasionally on David's continued decline and eventual disappearance from our lives entirely. On the second anniversary of Margaret's death, I sat in her garden with a glass of wine and read the final letter she'd left for me, the one I was supposed to open only after everything was finished. "My darling Robert," it began, "if you're reading this, then David showed you exactly who he really is, and you found the strength to let him go. I know how much this must have hurt. I know how hard it must have been to turn away from the child we loved so much." The letter went on to explain her deepest thoughts about David, her gradual realization that the son they'd raised had become someone neither of them would recognize. "I hope you understand now that we didn't fail as parents. We loved him. We gave him every opportunity. We showed him right from wrong. But somewhere along the way, he chose to become someone else, someone cruel and selfish and empty. That choice was his, not ours." The final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. "I need you to know that you gave me the greatest gift of my life. 42 years of true partnership. You loved me completely, supported me absolutely, and stayed by my side until the very end. Don't let David's betrayal make you doubt the love we built together. Don't let his darkness dim the light we shared. Live, my darling. Be happy. Find joy in the time you have left, and know that I'll be waiting for you when your time comes. Proud of the man you've always been." I sat in that garden as the sun set, surrounded by the roses Margaret had planted, holding the words of the woman who had protected me even in death. For the first time since her funeral, I felt completely at peace. David had made his choices. He'd chosen greed over love, selfishness over family, immediate gratification over long-term happiness. Those choices had led him exactly where they always lead, to emptiness, isolation, and regret. But I had made different choices. I'd chosen to honor Margaret's memory, to protect the legacy we'd built together, to find meaning in helping others rather than enabling destructive behavior. As I walked back into the house that night, I realized that Margaret had given me one final gift. She'd shown me that sometimes letting go of toxic people, even when they're family, isn't giving up on love. It's protecting love. It's choosing to nurture the relationships that give life meaning rather than drain it away. I poured myself another glass of wine, raised it toward Margaret's photograph on the mantel, and whispered, "Thank you for everything, my love. Thank you for showing me the way home." Outside, the November wind rustled through Margaret's garden, but inside, finally, there was nothing but peace.